On from a video that I made somewhat tongue-in-cheek about using ChatGPT to write poetry, I'd like to do a bit of a longer and more serious look at its research abilities. And essentially, this video is that ChatGPT is both incredibly impressive in terms of some of its research capabilities, but also needs to be used with a few warnings. Sam Altman from OpenAI has claimed that ChatGPT 5 is essentially PhD level. So I decided to test it against some of the PhD work that I've done with a student recently completing some work on William Blake, which is also the subject of my own PhD. Whilst I tend now to do much more work around tech, etc., I was very interested to see what ChatGPT would produce in terms of a kind of literary analysis. And the short version, which I'll go through in more detail in this talk, is that actually it can produce some incredibly impressive results, but that if you simply take them at face value, there are a huge number of problems for reasons that I'll go through. So this was not by any means a scientific test, but actually just a quick and dirty test using the research feature, which is available in the pro version of ChatGPT. And I asked the question, what are the consequences of Blake's orderings of Knight 7A and B in the four zoas? How do these affect our reading, and what is the primary research in this field? I just want to make a couple of observations about this. So first of all, I intend to do an awful lot more work with ChatGPT research. I actually tend to use Notebook LM on a very regular basis, which I'll return to the reasons why at the end of this video. But if I was doing a serious research project, I would actually spend more time carefully crafting the prompt. This was very much a quick and dirty test to see what ChatGPT 5 is capable of. And actually, an immediate point I'll make is that if you use this in the free version, which doesn't have the research capabilities, you get the fairly standard ChatGPT reply, if I'm honest. A series of bullet points and headings with an awful lot of work for you to do, you know, read secondary literature, look out for books on the four zoas. So research is much, much better than that. However, a couple of comments to add to this as well. It drew attention immediately. I mean, ChatGPT came back instantly with this response to tailor the research effectively. Could you clarify what you're most interested in? Absolutely. As I say, this was a very quick prompt that I would actually expect to build up into something more substantial. I then responded to that, and I'll also add, if you've never heard of Knight 7A and B, I'm not surprised. I think 99.999 recurring of the population has not heard of this issue, which is precisely why I picked it. It's actually a topic that I've been involved in some PhD work in the past couple of years. It's very specialist, and I wanted to see how ChatGPT would respond to something of that nature. It took, as it indicates here, it took about 8 minutes to find 20 sources, and I'll return to those sources in a moment, around 24 searches. And then altogether, the entire process was 25 minutes, after which it produced this report. And actually one of the virtues of working with the ChatGPT Pro version is that you are then able to download and save a version either as a link or as a PDF, which I've done previously. So I'll just go into the PDF, and as you can see, the version that's produced, it's not dissimilar at all to an academic paper. It's extremely well formatted. It's one of the things I quite like generally about ChatGPT, that it produces these clean documents which you can then go on to edit and work with. I will also make a general comment that actually the style of writing is clear, lucid, and I was actually very impressed with a lot of the response. I'll just read a tiny bit from the beginning here. William Blake's The Four Zoas presents a notorious textual puzzle. The manuscript contains two sections, both entitled Knight the Seventh. Scholars refer to these overlapping segments as Knight the 7th A and Knight the 7th B. As you can see, it's a very detailed bibliographic and textual analysis detailed one. And my first response, reading through this fairly quickly, was actually, this would be a decent basis to start off with for discussing some of the thematic elements of Night the Fourth in William Blake's The Four Zoas, his epic immense poem, which he never completed, as well, and what I was particularly interested in terms of a literature review. So as a kind of thematic introduction, it works fairly well. As the basis for a literature review, I would fail this. This would not work. This comes nowhere near the requirements of PhD work. And actually some of this, as I'll go and show, is not actually, I think, not entirely ChatGPT's fault. What started to draw my attention to this, and I will scroll down, going through the various sections, talking through different editors and how they have responded, before coming to the element in terms of sources. So a general comment that I would make, and I'm going to deal with this relatively quickly here, although I spent a great deal of time reading through the entire document, and in particular clicking through the notes and references. So one of the things that's particularly I appreciate quite a lot about ChatGPT in its current format is that it does offer sources and references for where it gets information, and this is particularly important with dealing with issues around hallucination. It's not that it never does hallucinate, but it's easier to keep track. And it provided that the document that was produced provided some 73 references, which sounds incredibly impressive until you realise that, I'll click on a couple of here, that 38 of them, over half, refer to the same document. I'm just picking a couple of random here. So, it very helpfully highlights the sections where it's taking information from. Actually, this one seems to be quite a lot of information, but they're all coming from this paper, The Order of Nights 7a and 7b in Blake's The Four Zoas. And that's for 38. Now, strictly speaking, because it provides its sources, it indicates where material's taken from, I wouldn't call this plagiarism per se, but it's highly derivative of one text. Now, an interesting one here is that immediately underneath this is another paper called Editing the Four Zoas. Now, this is exactly the kind of work, and indeed I know this paper, this is exactly the kind of work I would expect ChatGPT to engage with in responding to the question that I asked, but it only gives one reference. And the reason for this, which will come on to why it's still very difficult to use ChatGPT in supporting proper academic research, is that past the first page, you have to log in. You have to have some kind, you either pay for it or you have institutional access to get hold of this information. Related to this then, it draws, in the paper, it draws attention to these various editors, Geoffrey Keynes, G. E. Bentley, David Erdman, Alicia Ostrika. These are significant scholars who've worked on this precise problem that I asked about the Four Zoas. And it gives what seems to be fairly, comprehensive information in relation to those. However, one thing that threw me, and again, I would not at all consider this PhD level work, is that it draws attention to the fact that the sources for this information are actually reviews of the books, not the books themselves. And this for me is highly problematic. The source, as you can see here, Blake and Illustrated Quarterly, which is the journal for Blake studies. It's not that I have issues with the source of the particular information, but it draws attention to the fact that because it's discussing content that is in books and thus not openly available on the open web, this is copyrighted material which ChatGPT cannot, at least officially, access openly and directly. This is a massive problem when engaging in this kind of deep research in certain fields where more traditional routes of publishing that are not simply open access on the web, for better or for worse, whatever you consider of that. And I actually am open to a number of interpretations of that particular issue, which surprises many of my literary colleagues. I'm generally a big fan of open access scholarship and publishing. However, that is not the common approach across huge swathes of academic information and publishing and research. And so ChatGPT basically struggles to access this information. What this means is that whilst it can produce incredibly authoritative sounding responses, it's hamstrung by what's available in the open web. And actually, in some cases, this is material that's quite old. So as I was reading through this document, there were no references to more recent scholars, John B. Pierce, or even a figure, Donald Alt, who died a few years ago, but published his work after this open access document it relies on. So that's a fundamental problem. As I say, it's not necessarily a problem with the large language model itself in terms of its analysis and its ability to structure and document information. But it is that issue of garbage in, garbage out. By this, I very specifically mean in this instance, not that it's just going to random sources, although there were a couple which did raise an eyebrow for me. It's the fact if you don't have access to all the authoritative sources, it severely limits the capabilities of what can be done with research. So I think ChatGPT, and I intend to actually do this with them, in terms of sources which are more openly available, and look at ways in which you will shape and engage with different prompts. But with regard to certain fields where information is effectively withheld from open sharing via the internet in particular, and other databases, online databases, this means that ChatGPT is incapable of fulfilling a potential promise, which I think is an interesting one, of providing serious, rigorous academic research for scholars.